to everybody. What I'd like to actually do is to share with you a few thoughts about how modern retail can shape and is shaping consumer behavior. I looked at the theme of the conference, which is communication to commerce and converting share of voice to sale. And then I said that if I were to look at that theme, which is communication to commerce and converting share of voice to sale, what we know in the retail business is that we are looking after sales. Every single transaction for us is important in terms of sales. And so I'll try and weave together something which kind of combines, on the one hand, classical marketing, on the other hand, what we do in retail, and thirdly, an area which is still relatively new in retail, which is how do you finally do marketing in retail? Most cases, when you talk about marketing in retail, people think it's about running consumer promotions or giving a scheme. But I'd like to take that subject beyond consumer promotions and a scheme. First, let me just dwell on what we call as who is a consumer. And this is something which is very familiar for all of you all who are brand owners. And what my definition is that it's a passive recipient of advertising messages. So the one hand, you have the communication agencies or the advertising agencies, and they actually, broadcast messages either on television or in print. And then they are hoping, as per targeting, that there is a certain consumer who's actually looking at these messages. So, when you are sitting at 9 o'clock in the night after your dinner and in your couch or in your sofa, sit on your sofa set and watching something on television, in pops these few ads which talk to you about how you should immediately get out and start buying something. So when you really look at it, a consumer is in that sense a statistic, a person whom we have targeted. We have a message going to that consumer. And in most cases, they are reasonably passive because it's rarely that you have consumers watching advertising on their tablets or on their phones while they're actually shopping. Most of the time, they're watching advertising or reading a newspaper when they're at home, and to that extent, relatively passive, not in the mood or mindset to spend at that point of time. So who's a shopper? A shopper is an active agent of purchase decisions. And as you can see in the previous slide, we only had an interaction between brand and the consumer. Here you can see there's brand, there's retailer, and there is a shopper. Now, when I talk about a shopper is not necessarily a customer. A shopper is somebody who's walked into a store of ours, looking around and trying to figure out whether he or she should buy or not. So they're in the frame of mind to buy, but they have not yet actually translated that into a purchase. And how does this transition happen from a consumer to a shopper? So if you were to look at this, and I borrowed this very theoretical model from a consulting company called Integer, what you do see is that on the one hand, you have at the bottom end, which is the consumer, and the top you have the shopper. And when you really look at the classical marketing theory of awareness, consideration, intent, and purchase, what you do notice here is that at the awareness and the consideration level, you still are at the consumer level. But the moment you go beyond consideration and then you are an active recipient or participating in making a purchase decision, then you actually become a shopper. And then you make a purchase, and then you become a customer. And then after that, you go back again into being a consumer. So that is a transitionary state that happens to an individual, moving from a consumer to a shopper, and then from a shopper to a customer. So when you look at it from that perspective, typically there are different roles that different brands, products, and stores have in this entire journey from being a consumer to shopper to customer. So let's look at it at the first perspective. Say, if you look at it as a consumer, I want to buy Lux soap. So I am actually a consumer looking at Lux advertising on television. I'm in my mind thinking I need to buy a Lux soap, and because of which I know about the brand. I walk into a store, and then I'm looking around, and then I decide, should I buy this size of Lux soap, or should I buy this version of Lux? Or maybe I might also be tempted by the other brands which are there on stage in the store. So that is when I'm actually actively considering and actively in the state of making a purchase decision, and I'm a shopper at that point of time. And at the end of it, I might end up either buying Lux soap, or I might buy another brand of soaps, and then I become a consumer. So when you look at it, at the first level, which is at the brand level, is where a lot of the marketing companies play. And that's where a lot of the marketing companies actually, do the things in terms of advertising and communication and various other things in order to be able to make sure people are aware of their brand. Then at the second space is where we actually call, and now when I talk about at the shopping level doesn't necessarily need to happen inside a store. Shopping can happen anywhere. So when I'm actually actively considering, I might get onto the internet. I might actually look at a few websites. I might go to a few company sites. I look at information which is available about the different brands and products. I then talk to a few people. I ask them, what should I do? Should I look at this? Should I look at that? I actually go to a few peer review sites and understand people who have bought previously, what is their opinion of certain brands and products. So at that point of time, I'm doing all of these things and not necessarily all within a store. It can happen at any point of time. And then finally, I translate that into a purchase. And then when I translate that into a purchase, it's a purchase which happens not necessarily in a brick and mortar store. It could be a purchase which happens on the internet, through e-commerce sites. It could be something that has happened through a multi-level marketing site, like say an Amway, an Avon, or a Tupperware. So there are several ways in which I can actually, culminate that purchase either in a store or outside of a store. So when you look at it, this model applies to all of retail, not necessarily only to brick and mortar retail, but also to other kinds of retail like e-commerce, etc. But the transitionary stages tend to remain the same. So when I look at a customer is somebody, is a shopper, somebody who's actively considering a purchase decision, who's translated that into an actual purchase. So I have what we call as footfall or traffic within our stores, and then we have what is known as conversion. And conversion is the translation of the people who walked into your store who walked out with a shopping bag. And that conversion might vary depending on the kind of store, but ultimately that conversion is what translates a shopper into a customer. And that is essentially what makes the difference between a retailer and a marketer. Because as retailers, we're very happy if somebody were to buy anything from our store once they walk in. But as a marketer, you're very happy when they come in to buy your brand from our store. So when you really look at it, essentially, we want to make sure that everybody who comes in the store walks out with the shopping bag. And the marketer wants to make sure that anybody who comes in has to buy their brand when they come in to your store. So there is at some stages some convergence in thinking where we want to think alike, and at some stages there might be some differences also in the way we want to think when we want to translate that action into a purchase. Let me just now dwell on retailing, retail and what's been happening and what is the changes that we have been seeing over the last few years. One of the things that we know today is that the landscape is changing quite significantly. The number of formats which are there, the number of locations, the number of channels and the number of services offered in retail is incredibly higher than what was there 5 years back or 10 years back. The more number of modern retail stores that you see, the number of shopping malls that you have in the different cities, all of that has actually exploded in the last 5 to 7 years. We also know that shopping behavior is changing. And when you look at shopping behavior, it's also the type of the way in which you actually buy. And what you do see here is that, we must remember that we are finally a pretty large country with a very young population. So when you look at India with an average age of 25, what you do realize is that in many homes you actually have 3 generations living there. There is the older grandparents who typically tend to be 60 plus. Then you have the parents whom we might define as the middle-aged and who could be, let's say, less than 60, hopefully above 20, 25. And then you have the youth who are less than 25. And many of them actually live. And the 3 consumer segments sometimes actually exhibit 3 different kinds of behavior. The youngsters, the way they spend money, the older people, how they spend money, and the aged people, how they spend money. And when you really look at it, it's not about treating the house as one unit and treating that house as being uniform in terms of spending behavior. But that house then, or that home, actually has got 3 different customer segments which need to be catered through 3 different ways. So when you look at how they spend money, there are youngsters who might walk into malls, who look at what's in the window, and then tend to do what is called as impulse purchase. Then you have the slightly older age group who might actually think twice about what they need to spend, balance between what is important and what is, immediate, and then decide, what products and brands will they spend their money on. So that is one change that we are seeing in terms of shopper behavior. The second that we're seeing in terms of shopper behavior is the frequency of purchase. In the old days, I remember my mother when, about 30, 35 years back, and I used to live in Bangalore in those days, and I continue to live in Bangalore. She used to go to this place called Russell Market, and around Russell Market, there's a little square, and there are a lot of provision stores which are there, and there's one central store, and she used to go to that central store, owned by a Muslim gentleman, and whatever you required for the entire month, based on a shopping list, used to be ordered with him, and that person would actually pick up everything and put it inside the car, and then we take it back home. And then after that, if she required anything which is rare during the course of the month, she just call up that person, and they would send some what you call as top-up groceries. However, today when I look at the way my wife buys, I don't see her doing the monthly shopping trip, as we call. What she does is probably a weekly, sometimes, bi-weekly, sometimes thrice a week. She goes to the store to buy things. It's not always that she buys for the whole month. She buys in smaller units, smaller quantities at more frequent intervals which are there. And then when I see the way my children spend money, my 18-year-old son, he actually thinks of something when he wants to spend. So there is no forward planning at all. So he thinks for today when he wants to actually spend. And then if you really look at the way they buy, it actually can be seen. So if I ask my mother how many kilos of rice would you have bought for the month, she'll have an exact number. If I ask my wife, she actually doesn't remember how many kilos it is, but she remembers she bought it 4 times during the course of the month. So there are differences also in the way shopping behavior happens. Now when you buy frequently, obviously where you buy from makes a big difference. You might be willing to travel 15 kilometers away chasing that one deal if you're buying once a month. But when you want to buy twice a week, obviously you're not going to travel 15 kilometers. You'll want to go to some place which is closer, more accessible. And you don't mind sacrificing price for convenience, which have to cater to different shopping trips and for different shopping intentions. I talked to you about consumer segments and about the fact that there are different kinds of consumer segments. The other thing that we need to remember is also that lifestyle patterns are changing quite rapidly. People are today more conscious about brands. Earlier, you might have just been happy going in and buying atta, but today you want branded atta. You want Annapurna because that to you, even in a commodity space, like say atta, sugar, rice, translates into some kind of value. So you're looking for brands versus products. With the larger number of working women, what you're also seeing is that the balance between eating out and eating at home is also changing. So the whole food services business is transforming itself from merely being catering to people on the weekends to also being to cater to people on the weekdays. Entertainment, travel, transportation, lots of things in terms of how we look for life. If you look at a city like Hyderabad, the number of things which are called spas and salons, which have actually come up in the last 3 to 5 years, which actually promise you a body beautiful, is actually much higher than what you would have probably remembered even, earlier. If you wanted to go to a spa, you might have to come to a hotel like the Taj Krishna or some 5-star hotel to find it. But today you have a lot of day spas which are there across the country. But this whole focus on health and making sure that you look good, feel good, is something which is driving this entire beauty business. So lifestyle patterns are changing, and that's getting mirrored in the kinds of options that you have. Media options are also changing, and we all know that very clearly. The youngster less than 18 years of age rarely reads the daily newspaper, rarely reads something which is in print. Whereas when you ask them about their consumption of digital media or the amount of time that they spent on the internet, what you do realize is that there is a dramatic difference between when I was an 18-year-old versus my son who's an 18-year-old. So there are different media consumption patterns depending on the age group of the customer.